On the night she first noticed the sound, it was nearly midnight, and the house was quiet in the way only a parsonage can be quiet, like it's holding its breath. The clock over the stove ticked too loud. The wind pressed against the windows. And then there it was again, a low hum from the garage that didn't belong to any prayer or hymn she knew. She stood still, barefoot on the cold tile, and listened, her heart tapping faster than the clock. This wasn't the life she imagined when she said, "I do," to a pastor with kind eyes and a steady voice. Everyone in town thought they knew him. He preached every Sunday with calm authority, speaking about forgiveness, service, and faith that holds you up when the world feels heavy. He married couples, buried the dead, prayed with the sick, and remembered everyone's name. He smiled easily, laughed softly, and never raised his voice. When she married him, people hugged her and said she was blessed. They said she had found a good man, a man of God. She believed them. She still wanted to believe them. They met in a place that felt safe. He was volunteering at a food drive, sleeves rolled up, handing out boxes and jokes with equal care. She liked how he listened, how he asked questions and waited for the answers. Their dates were simple: coffee, long walks, shared silences that didn't feel awkward. When he proposed, it was quiet and sincere, just the two of them, no crowd, no spectacle. She said yes because it felt right, because she trusted the man in front of her. Married life settled into a rhythm. Early mornings, late nights, shared meals and shared prayers. He prepared sermons at the kitchen table, papers spread like a map. She learned the church calendar, the faces in the pews, the way grief and joy could live side by side. She learned that loving a pastor meant sharing him with everyone else. That part wasn't easy, but she accepted it. She believed in the work they were doing together. What she didn't accept, what she couldn't explain, were the nights he left after dinner with an excuse that felt rehearsed. "I'll be back soon," he'd say, grabbing his jacket, eyes warm but distant. Sometimes it was a hospital visit. Sometimes a meeting. Sometimes he didn't say. He always came back before dawn, careful and quiet, like he didn't want to wake the house. Like he didn't want to wake her questions. At first, she told herself not to worry. Pastors keep odd hours. Faith doesn't follow a schedule. But worry has a way of growing when it's ignored. It started with small things. The way his phone stayed face down. The way he showered immediately after coming home. The way he avoided her eyes when she asked how his night went. He never lied outright. He just didn't say much. The town slept while he worked. That thought bothered her more than it should have. One night, she stood at the window and watched his taillights disappear, the red glow shrinking until it vanished. The house felt bigger without him, the walls too thin. She prayed, not for answers, but for peace. It didn't come. Rumors travel fast in small places, even when no one says anything out loud. She noticed the looks at the grocery store, the pauses in conversation when she walked into a room, the way one woman squeezed her hand a little too tight and said, "You're strong," without explaining why. Strong for what? She wanted to ask. She didn't. She tried to talk to him. One evening, after he came home earlier than usual, she poured 2 cups of tea and sat across from him. Her voice shook despite her efforts. She asked if everything was okay. He smiled and said yes. He thanked her for worrying. He told her he loved her. His answers were gentle, practiced, and empty. When she reached for his hand, he held it, but only for a moment. Sleep became difficult. She lay awake listening for the garage door, counting the minutes, imagining every possibility and rejecting them one by one. She knew better than to jump to conclusions. She knew trust mattered. But trust also needed light, and she felt like she was living in the dark. Then came the night she followed him. She didn't plan it. It wasn't driven by jealousy or anger. It was fear mixed with a need to understand. When he left, she waited a few minutes, grabbed her keys, and drove with her headlights low, heart pounding so loud she was sure he could hear it from the road ahead. She kept her distance, taking turns slowly, telling herself she'd turn back any second. He didn't go to the hospital. He didn't go to the church. He drove past familiar streets and into an industrial area she'd never had reason to visit. Warehouses, closed shops, a place that looked forgotten after dark. He pulled into a lot lit by flickering lights and parked. She stopped farther back, hands shaking, breath shallow. She watched him step out of the car and open the trunk. He put on gloves. He checked his phone. And then he disappeared through a side door with a sign she couldn't quite read from where she sat. Her stomach dropped. This was no prayer meeting. This was no emergency call. This was something else entirely. She waited, frozen, thoughts racing. She thought about vows and secrets. About faith tested not in sermons, but in silence. About the man she married and the stranger she was watching now. Part of her wanted to leave, to pretend she never came. Another part knew that once you stand on the edge of truth, there's no easy way back. Minutes stretched. Her phone buzzed with a message from him. Running late.
Don't worry.
She stared at the screen, tears blurring the words. Don't worry. The phrase felt heavier than any confession. She didn't know what his night job was. Not yet. She didn't know why a pastor would need to hide it, or why it led him here, to a place that hummed with secrets after dark. All she knew was that the life she thought she understood was cracking open, and what waited inside could change everything, her marriage, her faith, and the way the town saw them both. She took a deep breath, stepped out of the car, and walked toward the door, unaware that once it opened, nothing would ever be the same. The door didn't open when she reached it. Not right away. She stood there, hand hovering inches from the handle, listening to the low mechanical sounds coming from inside. Not loud, not threatening, just steady, purposeful. Like work, real work. Her heart told her to knock, but her feet refused to move. Instead, she leaned closer, trying to understand what kind of place this was and why her husband, the pastor everyone trusted, was here in the middle of the night. She didn't go in. Not yet. Fear won that battle. She stepped back, returned to her car, and drove home with her thoughts racing faster than the road beneath her tires. She didn't sleep at all. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of their marriage, searching for signs she might have missed. The gentle smiles, the careful words, the way he prayed longer on some nights, like he was carrying something heavy he couldn't put down. By morning, he was home, already showered, already dressed for the day. He kissed her forehead like nothing had happened. Like he hadn't just stepped out of a life she knew nothing about. She wanted to scream, to ask questions she wasn't ready to hear answers to. Instead, she smiled back. The distance between them felt wider than ever. She needed context. She needed to understand the man she married before she could confront the secret he was keeping. So she went back in her memory to before the wedding, before the church, before the town wrapped him in expectations and titles. He once told her his calling didn't come easily. That faith wasn't something he found overnight. He had struggled, doubted, questioned. She admired that honesty. It made him feel real. But now she wondered how much of that struggle was still alive. The town had always treated him like a symbol more than a person. He noticed everything. He remembered the broken families, the lonely elders, the kids who needed guidance. People came to him with their worst moments, their deepest secrets. She saw how that weight followed him home, how his shoulders sagged when no one was watching. Maybe his night job was connected to that. Maybe it was another way of helping. Or maybe it was something he believed he had to do alone. Days passed and the pattern continued. Sermons on Sundays about truth and light. Late nights filled with silence and unanswered questions. She became more observant. She noticed his hands sometimes bore small marks. Nothing serious, just signs of physical work. She noticed his clothes smelled faintly of oil or metal on certain nights. Not the scent of hospitals or old books. Something industrial. Something hidden. She tried asking indirectly. She mentioned hearing noises in the garage. She joked about his mysterious schedule. Each time, he smiled and brushed it off, assuring her everything was fine. He wasn't angry. He wasn't defensive. That somehow made it worse. It felt like he was protecting her from something, deciding for her what she could handle. At the church, whispers grew louder. Not accusations. Curiosity. People wondered how he managed so much. How he always seemed tired but never complained. How he was never seen past a certain hour, even though everyone knew he was out there somewhere. A deacon once asked her if he was taking on too much. She nodded politely, but inside, she felt the question twist into something sharper. Taking on what? One afternoon, she visited the old photo albums stored in the attic. She hadn't looked through them since they moved in. She hoped they might offer clues, some forgotten piece of his past. Between faded family pictures, she found an envelope tucked into a book. Inside were certificates, training documents, things that didn't match the life she knew. Nothing illegal. Nothing dangerous. Just unexpected. Skills learned long before the pulpit ever called him. That discovery didn't give her answers. It gave her more questions. That night, when he left again, she didn't follow. Instead, she waited by the window, watching the dark swallow the street. She realized something important then. Whatever his night job was, it wasn't new. It had roots. It had history. And it mattered enough for him to risk his marriage staying in the shadows. Her faith began to feel tested in a way she never imagined. She believed in honesty. She believed in partnership. But she also believed in grace. She didn't want to break something that might still be whole underneath the silence. So she waited, even as the tension grew heavier, even as the house felt less like home. One evening, after a particularly emotional service, he came home earlier than usual. He sat at the kitchen table without speaking, staring at his hands. She could feel the words pressing against his chest, begging to be released. She sat across from him, close enough to touch, far enough to let him breathe. Neither of them spoke. The air between them was thick with everything unsaid. Later that night, she heard the hum again. Louder this time. Not from the garage, but from his phone. She glanced at the screen when he stepped away. No names. Just a notification. A reminder. Something scheduled. Something ongoing. Her chest tightened. This wasn't a one-time thing. This was a commitment. She realized then that secrets don't just hide truths. They create distance. And distance, left unattended, grows into something dangerous, not because of betrayal, but because of silence. She loved him. That much hadn't changed. But love without understanding felt fragile, like glass under pressure. Outside, the town slept, unaware that its pastor lived two lives, one bathed in light, the other wrapped in shadows. And inside the house, a marriage stood at a crossroads, balanced between trust and truth, waiting for the moment when one question could no longer be held back. She didn't know how much longer she could wait. She didn't know if the truth would bring them closer or tear everything apart. All she knew was that the night job wasn't just about him anymore. It was about them. And whatever he was doing after dark was slowly pulling the dawn farther away. She began to notice how differently people spoke to him, depending on the time of day. In the daylight, he was pastor, steady, warm, approachable. People leaned toward him when they talked, like his presence alone offered reassurance. At night, though, the few times she saw him just before he left, there was a shift. His voice lowered. His movements became precise. He checked things twice. It wasn't fear she sensed. It was focus. The kind that comes from responsibility, not habit. Her own life quietly changed around the mystery. She stopped inviting friends over in the evenings because she never knew when he'd leave or how long he'd be gone. She made excuses for his absence at community dinners. He got called away, she'd say, smiling through it. The words tasted thin. She hated lying. Even small lies meant to protect someone you love. Each one felt like a thread pulling loose. One afternoon, she met an older woman from the church who had known him long before he became a pastor. They sat together on a bench outside, watching children play. The woman spoke kindly, but there was something careful in her tone. She mentioned how he had always been good in a crisis. How he had handled difficult situations even when he was young. The phrase stayed with her. Difficult situations how? Where? The woman didn't elaborate, and she didn't push. But the past felt closer now, like a door she hadn't known existed. At home, she started paying attention to the silences between them. The way he paused before answering simple questions. The way he listened to her more than he spoke, as if measuring each word he offered. Sometimes she caught him watching her with an expression she couldn't name, concern, maybe, or guilt. Other times, he seemed lighter, relieved after returning from his night work, like he had completed something important. A small subplot unfolded quietly within her. Her faith, once steady, began to feel stretched. She still prayed, but the prayers shifted. They weren't just about guidance anymore. They were about clarity, about courage, about knowing when to wait and when to speak. She wondered if faith meant trusting without knowing, or seeking truth even when it hurt. The questions didn't come with easy answers. Meanwhile, the town continued its routine, unaware of the quiet tension building behind closed doors. But small moments hinted that not everything was as simple as it seemed. A police car parked briefly near the church late one night. A man she didn't recognize nodded at her husband in passing, eyes sharp, respectful, saying nothing. A locked drawer in his study she had never seen opened. None of it proved anything. All of it fed the growing unease. She began writing in a notebook, something she hadn't done since college. She didn't write accusations. She wrote observations. Dates. Times. Feelings. It helped her feel grounded, like she was gathering pieces of a puzzle instead of drowning in guesses. Sometimes she wrote about the man she loved, the one who brought her tea when she couldn't sleep, who remembered her favorite songs, who prayed softly beside her when words failed. Other times, she wrote about the stranger who walked out the door after dark. One night, a storm rolled in hard and fast. Thunder shook the house, rain pounding the roof. He was late, later than usual. She sat alone in the living room, lights off, listening to the storm and the clock. Her phone buzzed once with a message. I'm okay. Nothing more. Relief and frustration hit at the same time. She wanted to reply with questions, but she didn't. She waited, letting the silence speak louder than any text. When he finally came home, soaked and exhausted, she saw something new in his eyes. Not fear. Not shame. Resolve. He looked like someone who had stood in the middle of chaos and come through it changed, even if only slightly. She wanted to ask where he'd been, what had happened, why he carried the night on his shoulders. Instead, she handed him a towel. The distance between them felt heavy with restraint. Another angle emerged through someone unexpected, a young man from the church who started volunteering more often. He lingered after services, asked careful questions, watched her husband closely. One day, he thanked her quietly for sharing him with the community. The words were polite, but they carried weight. Sharing him how? She wondered if others knew more than she did, if the town held pieces of the truth she was missing. At times, she felt foolish for not confronting him directly. At other times, she felt wise for waiting. Secrets, she realized, don't always mean wrongdoing. Sometimes they mean protection. Sometimes they mean unfinished stories. But the cost of not knowing was growing. It showed in the way she hesitated before speaking, the way she flinched at unexpected sounds, the way her dreams filled with locked doors and unanswered calls. He noticed the change in her, too. He asked if she was tired, if she needed a break, if the role of being a pastor's wife was too much. His concern was genuine. That made everything harder. If he had been cold or distant, anger would have been easier. But he wasn't. He was still the man she married, just carrying something he couldn't or wouldn't share. The night job became less about where he went and more about what it represented. A line between them. A test of trust. A reminder that even in the closest relationships, there are rooms we don't enter without permission. She stood at the edge of one of those rooms now, hand on the door, waiting. As days turned into weeks, the pressure built quietly, like air in a sealed space. Something had to give. A truth. A confession. A choice. She didn't know which would come first. She only knew that the longer the mystery remained, the more it shaped them both, him in his silence, her in her watching. And somewhere between the sermons and the sleepless nights, between love and doubt, the question lingered unanswered. How long can a marriage hold when the darkest hours are lived apart and the truth waits just out of reach? The change came quietly, almost politely, which made it more unsettling. He started coming home later than ever before, sometimes just as the sky hinted at morning. His sermons grew more intense, focused on truth, hidden burdens, and the cost of carrying secrets alone. People nodded along, unaware that his words felt directed at someone specific. At her, at himself, at the space between them that was no longer empty, but crowded with unspoken things. She felt like she was living in two worlds that barely touched. In one, she smiled beside him after service, accepted kind words, listened to people praise his devotion. In the other, she sat alone at night, lights off, heart racing at every passing car. The contrast wore her down. Sleep became shallow. Food lost its taste. Even prayer felt strained, like she was afraid of what answers might come if she listened too closely. One evening, an unexpected knock broke the routine. A man stood at the door, not from the church, not from the neighborhood. He was polite, well-dressed and vague. He asked if her husband was home. When she said no, the man nodded as if he already knew that would be the answer. "Please tell him we need to talk," he said. No card. No name. Just a look that suggested urgency. When the door closed, her hands were shaking. When she told her husband about the visit, something in him tightened. Just for a second. But she saw it. He asked what the man looked like, what time he came, what exactly he said. His questions were calm, but his jaw stayed clenched long after the conversation ended. That night, he left without dinner. Without explanation. Without a promise of when he'd be back. She realized then that whatever his night job involved, it was moving closer to their front door. The next day, rumors rippled through the town, not loud enough to be clear, but sharp enough to feel. Someone mentioned unusual activity near the old industrial area. Someone else said they'd seen unfamiliar cars late at night. Nothing pointed directly to him, but the unease settled anyway. She wondered if the town's quiet trust was beginning to crack, just like hers had. Another subplot unfolded at the church. Attendance spiked unexpectedly. People seemed drawn to his sermons like they sensed something important was coming. Others stayed away, uneasy with the intensity in his voice. A few elders asked him to rest, to delegate, to slow down. He thanked them and kept going. She watched him pour everything he had into his work, as if preparing for something he couldn't name out loud. At home, the silence became heavier than arguments ever could have been. They shared space, but not truth. She caught herself rehearsing confrontations in her head, only to abandon them before they reached her lips. What if she was wrong? What if she forced a truth he wasn't ready to share? But what if waiting meant losing him entirely, to exhaustion, to secrets, to a life she wasn't allowed into? One night, she woke to the sound of voices outside. Low. Urgent. She peeked through the curtain and saw him speaking with two figures near his car. Their faces were hidden in shadow. The conversation ended quickly. He came back inside, locked the door, and leaned against it for a long moment before turning around. Their eyes met across the room. The tension was thick enough to touch. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Whatever he almost said stayed buried. Her notebook filled faster now. Not just observations, but fears. Questions she was afraid to ask. Lines like, what if loving someone means accepting what you can't understand? And how much silence is too much? She felt like she was standing on the edge of a truth that could either free them or destroy everything they had built. The final push came from within. One evening, as he prepared to leave, she asked him to stay. Just once. Her voice was steady, but her eyes gave her away. He hesitated, keys in hand, caught between two worlds. For a moment, she thought he would say yes. For a moment, hope flared. Then his phone buzzed. He looked at the screen, closed his eyes, and whispered, "I can't." The door closed behind him with a softness that somehow hurt more than a slam. She didn't cry this time. She grabbed her coat and followed. She kept closer than before, adrenaline sharpening her focus. The roads blurred as she followed familiar turns into unfamiliar territory. When he parked, she didn't stop far away. She parked nearby, heart hammering, breath shallow. She watched him walk toward the building, greeted by someone who clearly expected him. There was no hesitation now. No secrecy. Just purpose. She stepped out of the car, the cold air biting her skin. Each step toward the entrance felt heavier than the last. She thought about their vows. About trust. About how love sometimes demands courage instead of patience. She reached the door just as raised voices echoed from inside, not angry, but intense. Focused. Important. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. A message from him, sent seconds earlier. Please don't come in. No explanation. No apology. Just a plea. She froze, hand inches from the handle, torn between respect and desperation. Whatever waited on the other side of that door was the truth she had been circling for weeks. The truth that explained the night job, the secrecy, the distance. The truth that could change how she saw him forever. Behind the door, voices rose. Somewhere inside, a decision was being made. And outside, in the cold and the dark, she stood at the exact moment where waiting was no longer an option, but neither was turning back. The handle was cold under her fingers. And then everything went quiet. The silence didn't last long. It broke suddenly, not with noise, but with movement. The door opened from the inside before she could touch the handle. A man stepped out, startled to see her standing there. He looked at her face, then past her, then back again, like he was deciding something in real time. You shouldn't be here, he said quietly, not unkindly. Before she could respond, the door closed again, locking her out and locking the truth inside. Her phone buzzed immediately. This time it wasn't a message. It was a call from her husband. She answered without speaking. On the other end, his breathing was heavy, controlled but strained. Please go home, he said. I promise we'll talk. Just not tonight. The words sounded rehearsed, but the fear beneath them was real. She wanted to argue, to demand answers, but the line went dead before she could speak. She drove home in a fog, shock settling into something sharper. This wasn't just secrecy anymore. This was urgency, protection, maybe even danger. Not the kind you see on the news, but the kind that quietly rearranges people's lives. She sat in the driveway long after parking, staring at the house that suddenly felt fragile, like a stage set waiting to collapse. The next morning, everything escalated. A notice was taped discreetly to the church office door. Not official, not alarming at first glance, but enough to spark questions. A temporary closure of certain evening activities. No explanation. Just a signature she didn't recognize. By noon, the town was buzzing. People speculated. Some defended him fiercely. Others wondered out loud what kind of pastor needed that kind of privacy. She stood beside him as the whispers grew louder, her presence both a shield and a spotlight. He thanked people for their patience. He smiled when expected. But when their eyes met, something had changed. The unspoken agreement between them, to wait, to protect, to avoid, was breaking down. That afternoon, she received an unexpected visit. The older woman from the bench, the one who knew his past, came by unannounced. They sat in the kitchen, the kettle forgotten on the stove. The woman spoke slowly, choosing each word with care. She said she didn't know details, not really. But she knew that before the pulpit, before the collar, he had been trained to handle things others couldn't. Situations that required silence, discretion, strength under pressure. He didn't stop being that man, the woman said gently. He just added another calling. The words landed hard. Another calling. Not a betrayal of faith, but a collision of responsibilities. Still, it didn't explain why she had been kept in the dark. Or why people were showing up at their door. Or why his night job felt like it was spiraling closer to exposure. That night, he didn't come home at all. No message. No call. Just absence. By morning, fear outweighed patience. She called his phone repeatedly. Nothing. She went to the church, hoping to find him there. The office was empty, his study untouched, but his laptop was gone. His notes, too. It felt intentional, like preparation. The second twist came from a source she never expected, someone from the town council. A man she barely knew pulled her aside after a community meeting and asked, carefully, if her husband was still involved. When she asked involved in what, he hesitated, then said, things that aren't meant for public discussion. Her stomach dropped. This wasn't just a personal secret. This was something larger. Something that involved authority, influence, and risk. She began to realize the stakes weren't just emotional anymore. If the truth came out the wrong way, it could destroy his reputation, the church, and the trust of the town. But if it stayed hidden, it might destroy their marriage and possibly him. Late that evening, a car she didn't recognize pulled into their driveway. Two people stepped out. Professional.
Calm.
They introduced themselves carefully, avoiding titles. They asked if she had heard from her husband. When she said no, they exchanged a look. We believe he's doing what he thinks is right, one of them said. But things aren't accelerating. Accelerating. The word echoed long after they left. When he finally came home near dawn, he looked older. Not tired, worn. He sat at the table and stared at nothing. She stood across from him, heart pounding, every question rising at once. Before she could speak, he said her name softly. Not as a greeting, as a warning. There are things happening that I didn't expect to reach this point, he said. And if they do, you might hear things about me. About us. I need you to know, none of this started for the wrong reasons. That wasn't an explanation. It was a confession without details. And somehow it hurt more. She asked him one question. Just one. Are we safe? He didn't answer right away. That pause said everything. The town woke up that morning to rumors louder than ever. Social media posts. Half-truths. Speculation about the pastor with the secret night job. The man who preached light but lived in shadow. The pressure closed in fast, like walls moving inward. And in the middle of it all, she stood at the edge of the truth once again. Only now, stepping forward didn't just risk her heart. It risked everything they had built, and everything he was still trying to protect. The final door was coming into view. And this time it wasn't locked. The night everything finally collided, it didn't start with shouting or sirens. It started with a phone call that came just after midnight. He looked at the screen, went still, and then looked at her. Not with fear this time, but with a quiet seriousness that made her chest tighten. I need you to come with me, he said. Not as a request, as a decision already made. They drove together in silence, the road stretching dark and empty ahead of them. This was new. For weeks, she had been kept outside the circle. Now she was being invited in, and the weight of that moment pressed on her harder than any secret had. When they reached the building, the same industrial place that once filled her with dread, the doors were already open. Inside, the air felt charged, tense, alive. People moved quickly but calmly. Familiar faces and unfamiliar ones worked side by side. No chaos. No panic. Just urgency. He introduced her without titles, without explanations. She was simply with me. And that was enough. She saw now what he had been carrying, coordinating crises, guiding people through moments that could shatter lives if mishandled. This was his night job. Not a double life, but a hidden extension of the same calling. Then the real conflict surfaced. A situation had escalated beyond anyone's expectations. A family tied to the church, already fragile, was hours away from making a choice that couldn't be undone. Systems had failed them. Warnings had been ignored. And now the weight of intervention rested squarely on this small group working in the shadows. He was needed not as a pastor, not as a public figure, but as someone trained to stand steady when everything else shook. She watched him step fully into that role, calm and clear, his voice grounding everyone around him. In that moment, the man she married and the man she feared finally aligned. There was no split anymore. Just truth. Hours passed. The tension never fully eased. But eventually the crisis de-escalated. Lives weren't magically fixed, but disaster was avoided. When it was over, people exhaled.
Some sat down.
Some quietly left. He stood still, eyes closed for a moment, like he was letting the weight finally settle. Outside, just before dawn, she thought that was the end of it, that the story had reached its peak and would now gently fall into peace. She was wrong. As they prepared to leave, a man she recognized only from whispers stepped forward. He wasn't part of the team. He wasn't there to help. He spoke calmly, too calmly, and thanked everyone for their work. Then he looked directly at her husband and said, "You've done more than enough. From here on out, we'll handle things differently." The air shifted. She felt it before she understood it. In the car, she asked what that meant. He didn't answer right away. When he finally did, his voice was steady but heavy. He told her that his night job was ending, not because the work was done, but because someone else wanted control of it. Someone who didn't share the same values. Someone who saw influence instead of service. Here was the unexpected truth. The biggest risk was never the secret itself. It was who might use it if he stepped away without speaking. By morning, he made a decision that surprised everyone, including her. He didn't retreat. He didn't hide. He addressed the church again, this time with quiet authority. He spoke about integrity, about service done for the right reasons, and about knowing when to step out of the shadows so truth couldn't be twisted. He announced he was leaving his night role completely and publicly setting boundaries around what he would and wouldn't be part of. No accusations. No names. Just clarity. It disarmed the tension instantly. The power others hoped to gain dissolved the moment secrecy lost its grip. The twist wasn't that he had lived a hidden life. The twist was that he chose transparency at the exact moment silence would have been easier. The fallout came quickly, then faded. The operation restructured without him. The town moved on. Some people still whispered. But the danger passed. The threat lost its shape. And the marriage, tested, stretched, nearly broken, stood stronger than it had ever been. That night, back at home, the house felt different. Not fragile, not tense, just real. She realized the story wasn't about discovering a shocking secret. It was about what happens when love is finally invited into the hardest parts of someone's life. He married her as a pastor, but he stayed with her as a man who chose truth over fear, even when the cost was high. And as the sun rose, quiet and ordinary, she understood the final lesson. The most powerful transformation doesn't happen in the dark. It happens when someone finally turns on the light. When the truth finally came, it didn't arrive with drama or shouting. It came quietly, like most things that mattered. He waited until the house was still, until the noise of the town faded into the background. Then he spoke, slowly, carefully, as if each word carried weight. Before he became a pastor, he had trained in emergency response and crisis coordination. Not the kind people talked about openly. The kind that stepped in when systems failed, when people fell through cracks too narrow for public attention. Over the years, that work never truly let him go. When the town grew, when problems became more complex, he was asked, quietly, to help again. Not for recognition. Not for money. For people who needed help fast and privately, before situations spiraled into harm. His night job wasn't illegal. It wasn't dangerous in the way she feared. But it was sensitive, confidential, involved broken families, people on the edge, moments where the wrong move could cause real damage. He explained the odd hours, the industrial building, the unfamiliar faces. It was a secure coordination space shared by a small team trained to handle emergencies discreetly. They worked nights because nights were when things broke apart. "I didn't tell you," he said, voice low, "because I wanted to protect you from carrying it too. I thought if I kept the two worlds separate, I could manage both." She listened without interrupting, relief and hurt mixing together. The secret wasn't what she imagined, but the silence still stung. He admitted that when the pressure increased, when outside attention started creeping in, he panicked. Not because he was guilty, but because he was afraid of losing the trust of the town and the peace of their marriage all at once. The visits, the warnings, the closure notice at the church, those were precautions, not cover-ups. The unfamiliar people weren't threats. They were colleagues trying to keep a sensitive operation from turning into public spectacle. The pause when she asked if they were safe wasn't fear for himself. It was fear for her, if things were misunderstood. She asked the hardest question last. Why didn't you trust me with the truth? He didn't dodge it. He said he was wrong. He said love made him careful in the wrong way. He had mistaken silence for protection and forgot that partnership meant shared weight, not hidden burdens. The days that followed weren't easy, but they were honest. Together, they decided what could be shared and what had to remain private. He addressed the church with clarity, without details that would harm others. He explained that his night work was an extension of service, not a contradiction of faith. Some people were relieved. Others were skeptical. A few walked away. But many stayed, understanding that leadership sometimes meant doing quiet work without applause. The rumors faded once the truth found its shape. Not every question was answered publicly, and that was okay. The town didn't need every detail. It needed reassurance, stability, integrity. He stepped back from some responsibilities, set boundaries, and involved others so the weight no longer rested on him alone. At home, things slowly softened. Trust didn't snap back into place. It rebuilt itself in small moments. Late-night talks instead of late-night absences. Shared calendars. Honest check-ins. She joined him in prayer again, not out of habit, but connection. The house felt lighter, not because the world was simpler, but because it was shared. The older woman from the bench stopped by one afternoon and smiled when she saw them together in the kitchen. He was always meant to help in complicated ways, she said. But no one should do that alone. It felt like a blessing, not a warning this time. In time, the night job changed shape. Less secrecy. More structure. A clear end point. He didn't stop serving, but he stopped hiding. The garage went quiet. The hum disappeared. Sleep returned. So did laughter. Looking back, she realized the story wasn't about betrayal or scandal. It was about the danger of silence, even when intentions are good. About how easily love can drift into loneliness when truth is postponed. About faith not as blind trust, but as the courage to step into the unknown together. She learned that marrying a pastor meant sharing a calling, but also setting limits. He learned that strength didn't come from carrying everything alone. And the town learned that goodness doesn't always look simple, and service doesn't always happen in daylight. The night job no longer felt like a shadow. It was just a chapter, one that tested them, stretched them, and ultimately brought them closer than before. And when the house grew quiet again, it wasn't filled with fear or unanswered questions. It was filled with rest.